From the moment Emily and I first stepped into our new Victorian home, I sensed a heaviness in the air, but not in an unpleasant way. It was the kind of weight that made you feel anchored, grounded. The house stood proud, its weathered windows and faded paint worn smooth by years yet stubbornly intact, whispering stories of another time. We'd been searching for months for our dream house, and this place, despite its creaky porch and peeling paint, felt like fate. The realtor said it was full of potential, which usually meant it needed work, but to us, it was perfect. We imagined cozy mornings in the sunlit kitchen, winter nights by the fireplace, and maybe, someday, a nursery upstairs. We spent the first few days unpacking, arranging furniture, and exploring the beautiful neighborhood. The neighbors seemed to keep to themselves, offering polite but short greetings. At night, the wind would blow through the old trees in the yard, making them groan softly. It was a bit unsettling, but we brushed it off. Old houses made strange noises after all. It started small. On our third night in our new home, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I figured Emily had gotten up to get a glass of water, but when I glanced beside me, she was still there, sleeping and breathing steadily. The sound stopped as soon as I paused to listen. After several moments of silence, I fell back to sleep. The next evening, I heard Emily humming from downstairs. It was faint but clear, the melody coming from the kitchen. Smiling, I walked in to surprise her, only to find the room empty except for the television, which was on but oddly flickering. At that moment, I heard Emily in the upstairs shower. We laughed about it at first, joking about our resident ghost, but soon the laughter felt hollow. After about a week, I saw something I couldn't explain. I was walking from the living room to the kitchen to grab a snack from the pantry, when I caught a figure in the corner of my eye, tall, thin, and standing by the window. I turned to see what it was, but it was gone. Emily admitted she'd seen a shadow in the upstairs hallway 2 nights before, but she didn't want to mention it. She didn't want to upset me, and she just chalked it up to being stressed and tired. A few days later, Emily and I began to notice that certain rooms were unexplainably cold, even when the heat was on. Sometimes a faint smell of rot would drift through the house without warning. Our cat, Daisy, started avoiding the upstairs entirely, her back arching whenever we tried to carry her there. One night, we both heard whispering. We both sat up in bed, straining to listen. It wasn't just one voice, it was a dozen, layered over each other, murmuring words we couldn't understand. They came from the walls, from the floor, from everywhere. It was a whirlwind of unintelligible, furious conversation we could not untangle. I got up to check. My heart was pounding in my chest, but the voices stopped as soon as I stepped into the hall. Stone still, my ears tried to pick up any faint sound. Nothing but silence. Objects began to move. At first it was subtle, a picture frame tilted, a door that wouldn't stay closed. Then the events started to become more intense. I watched our coffee mugs slide across the counter on their own. One afternoon, I heard Emily scream when her glass of water flew off the table and shattered at her feet. Sleep became impossible. We'd lie awake in bed and listening to the creaks and groans, the soft tapping at the windows even when there was no wind. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every corner seemed darker than it should be. Then came the night I would never forget. It was just past midnight. Emily and I were downstairs in the living room, too afraid to sleep. The fire had burned down to embers when a sharp, deafening bang echoed through the house. Our cat Daisy froze in the hallway, her back arched and fur standing, eyes locked on an empty hallway. Then she hissed at something I couldn't see, but that I felt watching us. The whispering returned, louder now. It seemed to surround us, pressing against our ears. I grabbed Emily's hand, and that's when the kitchen erupted. Drawers slammed open and shut, plates shattered against the walls, and pictures plummeted to the floor. Our cat Daisy was so scared, she ran and hid under the couch. From the corner of my eye, I saw shadowy figures. They seemed to manifest from the dark corners of the house. Their forms were faint and indistinct. Black holes replaced where eyes should have been. Emily and I jumped out of fear as a lamp flew across the room, exploding against the wall inches from her head. Something yanked at my shirt from behind, hard enough to pull me backward. "Go!" I shouted to her. But as we reached the hallway, every door upstairs slammed shut at once. The front door was our only hope. We both ran. Our cat Daisy darted out from under the couch, bolting ahead of us. Emily grabbed her as we were running. I didn't care about the photographs, the clothes, the furniture. We just grabbed our coats and the car keys from the hook. When I flung the front door open, the air outside felt thin and sharp, like we'd been holding our breath for days. I turned on my car and we drove off without any thought of where we were going to go. My foot never left the gas pedal until the view of the house shrank in the rearview mirror. Neither one of us spoke a word on the entire car ride. We ended up going to my brother's place to spend the night with him and his family. Emily and I told him everything that happened that night. A few weeks later, we ended up selling the house. Now in our new home, laughter fills the rooms where silence once haunted us. We've started making new memories, bright ones, and for the first time in a long while, the future feels like ours again. It was my summer vacation coming home from college. I had just pulled into the driveway at my mother's home. The house stood there at the end of the path as it always had. I knew my mother was going to be away for a few days, so I was excited to have the house all to myself. As I stepped into my mother's house, it brought back memories of that faint smell of lemon polish and lavender, which reminded me of my grandmother, who I missed very much. I set my duffel bag down on the floor and just stood there, soaking in the silence. This was the first time I'd been home since my grandmother passed away. Mom had insisted on handling everything, packing up Grandma's room, sorting her things. I'd stayed away, burying myself in classes and pretending that my grandmother was still here, just out of sight. I made my way into the living room. That old couch sagged in the same spot where she always sat with her knitting. A framed photo of the three of us, me, Mom, and Grandma, still sat on the coffee table. I started going up the stairs towards my old room, the hallway lined with family portraits. One of them, my grandmother on her wedding day, caught my attention. Her eyes, even in the faded black and white, had a strange weight to them. Inside my old bedroom, I noticed everything was just as I'd left it last summer. Posters on the walls, books stacked by the desk, the old quilt my grandmother had sewn neatly folded on my bed. I unpacked some of my things, then wandered to the window and looked out over the yard. The big oak tree stood tall. I remembered swinging from its tire swing when I was little, Grandma calling for me to be careful. By the time I went downstairs to make myself something to eat, the house had gone completely quiet. No hum of the fridge, no ticking of the clock, as if the air itself had gone still. I ignored it and just started to microwave some leftovers Mom had left for me. It wasn't until I was rinsing my plate in the sink that I heard it. 2 faint knocks. They came from inside the wall to my left. I froze, soap still on my hands, listening. Nothing. I told myself it had to be the pipes or something. Still, when I went upstairs to my room that night, I left the hall light on. I woke sometime after 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, coming from the hallway outside my door. The kind of sound you would recognize instantly. Half awake, I thought of her, my grandmother shuffling down the hall in her slippers. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I laid there, heartbeat thudding in my ears, waiting for the gentle knock she always gave before coming in. It didn't come. Instead, there was silence. When I finally dared to get up, I opened the door to an empty hallway. The light I'd left on flickered once, then went out. The next morning, I wandered into my grandmother's old room. Mom had stripped it of most of her things, but the space still felt lived in. The curtains were drawn, the bed was neatly made with the quilt she'd always kept, pale blue and old. On the nightstand sat her Bible, still bookmarked with the faded ribbon she used for years. I remember growing up, sitting with her in this room almost every night as she would read passages to me before bedtime. On the second night, the noises came earlier, just before 10 p.m. I'd been lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, when a cold draft brushed across my face. My window was shut. The vent was silent. Still, the air had that sharp, thin bite, like the kind that creeps in when you step into a basement that hasn't been opened in years. Then came the knocks again, 2 of them, slow, deliberate. But this time, they weren't in the kitchen walls. They were behind my headboard. I sat up and pressed my ear to the wall. At first, there was nothing. Then a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, expecting to see a mouse or some kind of rodent scratching the headboard. But it was unmarked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right on the other side. The next morning, I tried to rationalize it. I kept telling myself old houses shift, wood creaks, animals get into walls. But the truth was, I was starting to believe that my grandmother hadn't really left. My grandmother's lavender scent kept appearing in random places. In the hallway, on the stairs, even in the closet where she used to keep her coats. It wasn't just the smell, though. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, shadows slipping along the floorboards, stretching toward me before vanishing when I turned my head. That night, I decided to talk to her. I sat on the edge of my bed feeling like an idiot and said quietly, "If it's you, Grandma, I'm glad you're here. I miss you." For a moment, the air felt warmer, almost comforting. But then, the light in my room dimmed, as though someone had turned a dial on the switch itself. The temperature dropped so quickly that my breath fogged in the air. And then a whisper. I couldn't make it out, but it was right by my ear, so close I could almost feel the lips moving. I froze. "Grandma?" And then nothing but silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. The third day, things went from unsettling to violent. I was in the living room, sitting on the couch with my laptop, when suddenly I heard loud footsteps coming down the stairs. I kept telling myself, there is no way this is happening. It felt straight out of a horror movie. Then came the crash from upstairs. I ran up to find my bedroom door wide open. My bag had been dumped on the floor, clothes thrown everywhere. The quilt my grandmother had made was balled up on the floor. I locked myself in the kitchen for the rest of the day, keeping the biggest knife we owned within reach. That night, I decided to sleep on the couch. I figured if I kept the lights on and stayed in the most open room, I'd be fine. I was wrong. Around 3 a.m., the air in the room seemed to shift. It felt like the shadows in the corners grew darker. And then, from the hallway, a figure emerged. At first, my heart leapt. I saw a tall figure, hunched, wearing what looked like my grandmother's old nightgown. I had a feeling that this thing wasn't my grandmother. As soon as I took a step back, the figure vanished into thin air. I scrambled backward, knocking over the small coffee table. My voice caught in my throat, and all I could do was stare at the hallway, frozen in fear. I don't know why, but all I could think of was that I needed to grab my grandmother's Bible. The thought slammed into my head like a desperate signal. My grandmother's Bible was still in her room. She'd never gone anywhere without it, never slept without it by her bed. If she'd known this thing was here and I was starting to think she had, it might be the only thing that could help me. I ran upstairs into my grandmother's old room. I yanked the drawer to open the nightstand. The Bible was there, worn and soft, the ribbon still marking the same page. Then I heard loud running footsteps in the hallway. Not really knowing what I was doing, I shouted the words to where my grandmother had bookmarked the Bible as loud as I could until my throat burned. Then, all of a sudden, I heard a loud groan. Then everything went silent. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I packed my bag in the dark and sat in my car in the driveway, waiting for the sun like it might never come. When I finally drove away, I felt such relief. I couldn't believe what I just experienced. Mom called later that day, her voice cheerful, asking how the house was. I told her I'd decided to cut my visit short and stay at my dad's house, that I'd see her when she got back. I didn't tell her why. Some things you just can't put into words. But that night, while unpacking my things at my dad's house, I was still trying to make sense of what just happened. After my mother came back home, I went to visit her. I explained what had happened to me while staying at her house. She said she had also experienced similar events, but not like the one I had just went through that night. My mother ended up getting the house blessed by our local priest. After, the house seemed to be back to normal. I ended up staying there for the rest of the summer until I had to go back to school. Till this day, I still wonder if that evil presence is still lurking around in that house. It started the week after I moved into my grandparents' old house. The place wasn't spooky by any stretch. Small, single story, the kind of house with floral wallpaper and squeaky cabinets. I'd inherited the house after my grandfather passed, and I figured it would be a quiet place to live and invest my time and money into fixing up the place. 3 nights in, I was suddenly woken by a knock at the front door. Not a loud bang, just 3 polite knocks. I rolled out of bed and stumbled to the door. The time on my phone read 3 a.m. sharp. Peeking through the peephole, I saw nothing. The porch was empty. I went to check the security camera feed on my phone, one of those simple, motion-activated setups I had just installed after hearing of a few break-ins in the neighborhood. But the footage had frozen mid-frame, grainy and static across the screen. The camera began working again about a minute later, showing only my empty porch. I convinced myself it was just some animal or something that accidentally activated the security camera. I locked the door and went back to bed. But the next night passed without incident, and so did the one after that. Then, exactly 4 nights later, it happened again. 3 slow knocks at exactly 3 a.m., empty peephole, static camera. By the 3rd time, I was starting to feel uneasy. It wasn't random anymore. It was scheduled. The more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. The knocks never varied. 3 slow taps, just loud enough to wake me up. Strangely, always at the same time. Always followed by that strange static on the camera feed. I tried to catch whoever or whatever it was. I stayed up late in the living room with the lights off, keeping an eye on the door. The moment the first knock sounded, I jumped up and pulled the door open. Nothing. No one on the porch, no sound of footsteps running away, nothing but the cold night air. That night, I was so freaked out I couldn't sleep. By the 5th incident, I decided to stay up and catch whatever was causing this on my phone. I set the phone up on the coffee table, facing the door, just to see if I could catch something the camera was missing. When the knocks came, I grabbed the phone immediately and replayed the footage. Here's what I saw. At 2:59 a.m., the door shook slightly, as if something had pressed against it. Then the picture began to warp, before cutting out entirely for about 10 seconds. When the feed returned, the door was still and the clock on the wall read 3 a.m. I didn't know enough about electronics to explain the interference, but it didn't feel like a coincidence that both the camera system and my phone would glitch at the same time. Then one night, after the knocks, I heard something new, a soft scrape along the bottom of the door, like nails or something sharp dragging across the wood. I was exhausted from days of broken sleep, too on edge to rest, too nervous to ignore it. Friends told me to call the police, but what could I tell them? That the boogeyman was politely knocking? One night, I decided I wouldn't just watch from behind the peephole. I would open the door immediately, no hesitation. I sat on the couch with my phone in my hand, staring at the door until the clock read from 2:59 to 3 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. I lunged forward, yanked the door open, and found no one. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. On the welcome mat were 3 small wet marks. Not footprints, but more like smudges, each shaped like a long, crooked oval. I reached for my phone to snap a photo, but the screen was dead. The battery, which had been at 80% moments earlier, was now completely drained. When I looked up again, the marks were gone. I shut and locked the door. I was so exhausted that I decided to just go to bed. It's been a month since then, and I haven't heard the knocks again. My friends and family believe something strange was definitely happening. My sister, who is a huge believer in the supernatural, suggested that it could have been our grandfather trying to get back into the house. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that I was glad it was over. Regardless, sometimes at 3 a.m., every few nights, I still wake up without knowing why. I check my phone, but nothing is there. The porch is always empty. I wish I knew what was knocking on my door all those times. Sometimes I wonder if it was somebody like a neighbor just messing with me and my security camera. I guess I will never know.